Welcome to the Extremely Boring Stories. Today we listening. The Roman Empire. The dust of central Italy does not speak, yet it holds the weight of 1,000 years of triumph and tragedy. Long before the marble palaces and the sprawling forums, there was only the Tiber River, winding through 7 humble hills. To understand the Roman Empire, we must look past the gold and the crowns, back to a time of iron, mud, and a hunger for survival that would eventually consume the known world. Legend tells us of 2 brothers, Romulus and Remus, born of a god and raised by a wolf. It is a violent origin story, ending in fratricide, a fitting prelude for a civilization that would often find itself at war with its own soul. But the reality was likely more gradual. Farmers and shepherds, tired of the raids from neighboring tribes, began to fortify the Palatine Hill. They weren't building an empire then, they were simply building a home. As the centuries turned, the kings were cast out. The Romans developed a deep, almost religious hatred for the concept of a king. In its place, they birthed the res publica, the public affair. This was the Republic. It was a system built on checks and balances, on the shared power of the Senate and the people. They believed that no one man should ever be the master of Rome. It is a bitter irony of history that the very system designed to prevent tyranny would eventually create the greatest autocracy the world had ever seen. The Roman soldier of this era was not a professional. He was a citizen farmer. He fought in the summer and harvested in the autumn. He carried a heavy shield and a short sword, the gladius, a weapon that would eventually redraw the maps of 3 continents. These men didn't fight for a paycheck. They fought for the glory of their family name and the survival of their city. But Rome could not stay small. To the south lay the sophisticated Greeks, to the north, the fierce Gauls, and across the sea, the merchant princes of Carthage. The Mediterranean was a crowded room, and Rome was starting to take up too much space. When the First Punic War broke out, Rome was a land power with no navy. They found a wrecked Carthaginian ship on their shores, took it apart, and built 100 copies. This was the Roman way. They didn't need to be the best at everything, they simply had to be the best at learning. They added the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned a sea battle into a land battle. They suffered horrific losses, losing tens of thousands of men to storms and incompetence, but they refused to surrender. In Rome, defeat was merely a delay of eventual victory. Then came Hannibal. If Rome was the unstoppable force, Hannibal Barca was the immovable object. For 15 years, he marched through the Italian countryside, defeating every legion Rome threw at him. At Cannae, he performed a masterpiece of slaughter, surrounding an army twice his size. On that day, the ground of Italy drank the blood of 80,000 Romans. Any other nation would have sued for peace. But Rome was different. They didn't even use the word peace in their vocabulary unless it meant total victory. They raised new legions, freed slaves to fight, and eventually took the war to Africa. When Scipio Africanus finally defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, the trajectory of the world was set. Carthage was broken. The Mediterranean was now a Roman lake. With the wealth of the east and west flowing into the city, the old ways began to rot. The citizen farmer was replaced by the slave-staffed plantation. The Senate grew fat and corrupt. The gap between the ultra-rich and the starving masses became a canyon. This tension needed a spark, and it found one in the Gracchi brothers, who tried to give land back to the poor and were murdered in the streets for their efforts. The era of political debate was over, the era of political violence had begun. As the blood of the Gracchi brothers stained the stones of the Roman Forum, a fundamental shift occurred in the Roman psyche. The era of the unwritten rules was dead. For centuries, the Republic had been held together not just by laws, but by a shared sense of duty and tradition. But now, the precedent was set. If you could not win an argument with words, you won it with a blade. Into this fractured world stepped 2 men who would redefine the meaning of power, Marius and Sulla. Marius was a new man, a commoner who rose through the ranks by sheer military brilliance. He did something revolutionary: he opened the army to the landless poor. No longer were the soldiers fighting for their own farms. They were now fighting for their general, the man who promised them loot and land at the end of their service. This changed everything. The legions were no longer loyal to Rome, they were loyal to the men who paid them. When Marius's rival, Sulla, marched his own legions on Rome to seize control, the city watched in horror. It was the first time a Roman general had turned his swords against his own capital. The public affair was becoming a private playground for ambitious warlords. Sulla eventually retired, hoping he had restored order, but he had actually provided the blueprint for the Republic's destruction. He had shown that the man with the most loyal soldiers held the ultimate veto. Transition to the rise of Caesar. In the wake of this chaos, a young man from an ancient but impoverished noble family began his climb. Gaius Julius Caesar was a man of immense charm, terrifying intellect, and an almost pathological need for greatness. He understood better than anyone that the old Senate was a walking corpse. To survive, he formed an uneasy alliance with the two most powerful men in Rome: Pompey the Great, the city's most celebrated general, and Crassus, its wealthiest financier. History calls this the First Triumvirate. Together, they bypassed the law, dictated elections, and carved up the world between them. But Caesar needed glory of his own. He took the governorship of Gaul, modern-day France, and spent nearly a decade in a brutal campaign of conquest. He wasn't just expanding borders, he was building a legend. His dispatches back to Rome were masterpieces of propaganda, painting him as a hero protecting the Republic from the barbarian hordes. By the time the Gallic Wars ended, Caesar had an army of veterans who would follow him into the pits of hell. The Senate, led by a jealous Pompey, grew terrified. They ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome to face trial for his political crimes. Caesar knew that to return without his legions was a death sentence. Standing on the banks of the Rubicon, a small, shallow river that marked the boundary of his province, he made a choice that would echo through 2 millennia. "The die is cast," he reportedly muttered, and he crossed the water. The civil war that followed was a global conflict, stretching from the deserts of Egypt to the plains of Spain. Caesar was fast, decisive, and surprisingly merciful to his enemies. When he finally stood alone as the victor, he didn't just take power, he became the state. He was named dictator for life. He began a whirlwind of reforms, fixing the calendar we still use today, giving land to veterans, and even granting citizenship to those outside Italy. But the ghost of the old republic still haunted the halls of the Senate. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, a group of conspirators, many of whom Caesar had forgiven and called friends, plunged their daggers into him. They believed they were liberators saving freedom. Instead, they unleashed a storm of fire that would burn the Republic to the ground. Transition to the age of Augustus. Rome didn't go back to the way it was. Instead, it fell into another decade of agony. The vacuum left by Caesar was filled by his young grandnephew and heir, Octavian, and his right-hand man, Mark Antony. For a time, they hunted down the assassins, but soon, they turned on each other. The world was divided. The West belonged to Octavian, a cold, calculating politician. The East belonged to Antony and his lover, the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. At the naval battle of Actium, the fate of the Mediterranean was decided. Antony and Cleopatra fled, eventually taking their own lives, leaving the young Octavian as the sole master of the Roman world. But Octavian was smarter than Caesar. He didn't call himself a king or a dictator. He took the title Augustus and called himself the first citizen. He kept the Senate, the elections, and the traditions, but it was all a grand performance. Behind the curtain, he controlled the army, the grain supply, and the treasury. This was the birth of the Principate, the empire in everything but name. Under Augustus, the chaos of the last century vanished. This was the beginning of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For the first time in memory, the gates of the Temple of Janus were closed, signaling that Rome was not at war. Trade flourished. Architecture reached new heights of splendor. Augustus famously boasted that he found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble. Yet, this peace had a price. The political freedom of the Roman citizen was gone, replaced by the stability of the subject. The legions were moved to the frontiers, stationed along the Rhine and the Danube to keep the world out, while inside those borders, a new kind of civilization was taking root, one that would spread the Latin language, Roman law, and Mediterranean culture from the damp forests of Britain to the scorching sands of Mesopotamia. With the transition from Augustus to his successors, the Roman Empire entered a strange and often terrifying new reality. The mechanism of power was now concentrated in a single office, and the personality of the man holding that office would dictate the fate of millions. The world was stable, the borders were secure, but at the heart of the empire, in the palaces of the Palatine Hill, a drama of absolute power and absolute corruption was beginning to unfold. Augustus had lived long enough to institutionalize his rule, but he could not control his bloodline. The succession passed to Tiberius, a grim, reclusive general who hated the theater of politics. Under Tiberius, the atmosphere in Rome grew paranoid. The treason trials began, where a whispered word against the emperor could lead to execution and the seizure of property. The emperor eventually retreated to the island of Capri, leaving the city in the hands of the ambitious and ruthless commander of the Praetorian Guard, Sejanus. This was a dark omen for the future. The elite bodyguards, meant to protect the emperor, were becoming the true kingmakers of Rome. When Tiberius finally passed, the city breathed a sigh of relief as a young, charismatic man named Caligula took the throne. At first, he was loved, the son of the heroic general Germanicus. But power, when absolute and unchecked, can fracture a mind. Within months, the relief turned to horror. Caligula began to demand he be worshipped as a living god. He emptied the treasury on lavish spectacles and eccentric architectural projects, including a bridge of boats across the Bay of Baiae just so he could ride his horse across the sea. Whether he was truly insane or simply mocking the Senate's weakness is debated by historians, but his reign ended the only way it could: at the end of a Praetorian's blade. The soldiers, while looting the palace after Caligula's murder, found a trembling man hiding behind a curtain. This was Claudius, the uncle of the dead emperor. Thought to be a fool because of his physical ailments and stutters, he was hoisted onto the soldiers' shoulders and declared emperor. To the surprise of the elite, Claudius proved to be one of Rome's most capable administrators. He expanded the bureaucracy, managed the grain supply, and achieved what even Julius Caesar had failed to do: the conquest of Britain. Under Claudius, the empire pushed into the mist-shrouded forests of the north, establishing Londinium and bringing the Roman lifestyle to the edge of the known world. But the palace was a viper's nest. Claudius's final wife, Agrippina, was determined to see her own son, Nero, on the throne. History suggests she poisoned Claudius with a dish of mushrooms, clearing the way for a 17-year-old boy who dreamed of being an artist rather than a ruler. The reign of Nero is often remembered for the Great Fire of Rome. In the summer of 64, a fire broke out near the Circus Maximus and raged for 6 days, turning much of the city to ash. Legend says Nero played his lyre while the city burned, but the reality was more complex. He used the cleared land to build the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a palace of such staggering scale it featured a rotating dining room and a 100-foot-tall bronze statue of himself. To deflect blame for the fire, Nero pointed the finger at a small, secretive Eastern cult, the Christians. This marked the first state-sponsored persecution of the movement, an act that would inadvertently help forge the identity of a religion that would one day conquer Rome itself. Nero's eventual suicide ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty and plunged Rome into a year of bloody civil war, known as the Year of the Four Emperors. It was a brutal reminder that the Pax Romana was fragile. Stability returned with Vespasian, a gritty, no-nonsense general. He understood that to keep the people happy, he needed to provide more than just bread, he needed to provide circuses. On the site of Nero's private lake, he began construction on the Flavian Amphitheatre, the Colosseum. Imagine the Colosseum on opening day. 50,000 people, from the poorest urban dwellers to the wealthiest senators, packed into the limestone tiers. The air would have smelled of sawdust, incense, and blood. They watched gladiators, men who were technically social outcasts but celebrated like modern athletes, fight for their lives. They saw exotic animals from the farthest reaches of the empire. Lions from Africa, tigers from India, bears from the north. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a political statement. The Colosseum was a microcosm of the Roman world, showing that the emperor controlled nature itself and that the price of Roman peace was the disciplined application of violence. By the 2nd century, the empire reached its golden age under the 5 good emperors. This was the era of Trajan, the Optimus Princeps, or best ruler. Under his command, the Roman borders reached their maximum extent, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Scottish Highlands. The wealth of the world poured into Rome. Trajan's Forum, a massive complex of marble and gold, stood as a monument to this peak. Trajan was followed by Hadrian, the traveler. Hadrian realized that the empire could no longer grow without breaking. He spent his reign traveling the provinces, consolidating the borders, and building the famous wall across northern Britain. He was an architect at heart, responsible for the Pantheon, the temple to all gods with its massive concrete dome, a feat of engineering that remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world today. Finally, we come to Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. While he sat in his tent on the cold Germanic frontier, fighting off invading tribes, he wrote his Meditations. He struggled with the weight of his duty and the fleeting nature of life. He was a man of peace forced to spend his life at war. His death in 180 marks the end of the Golden Age. As the sun set on the 2nd century, the cracks were beginning to show. The climate was changing, bringing shorter growing seasons. A mysterious plague, brought back by soldiers from the east, decimated the population. And for the first time in generations, the Germanic tribes were no longer just raiding, they were looking for a way in. The Roman world was still vast and powerful, but the effortless confidence of the early empire was fading. The age of iron and rust was about to begin. The death of Marcus Aurelius was more than just the passing of a wise ruler, it was the closing of a door. For nearly a century, the Roman world had known a succession based on merit, where the sitting emperor adopted the most capable man as his heir. But Marcus broke this tradition by leaving the empire to his biological son, Commodus. If the Golden Age was a period of stoic duty, the reign of Commodus was a descent into vanity. He fancied himself a new Hercules, entering the arena to fight as a gladiator, while the administrative gears of the empire began to grind with rust. His assassination on New Year's Eve in the year 192 ignited a fire that would nearly consume the Roman world. What followed was the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of such profound chaos that it is a miracle Rome survived at all. The empire was no longer a stable state, it had become a military trophy. During this half-century, more than 26 men claimed the title of emperor. Most were barracks emperors, generals who were raised to the purple by their troops one day and murdered by those same troops the next when the money ran out or a more generous commander appeared. As the leadership in Rome spiraled, the borders began to buckle. In the east, the revitalized Sassanid Persians captured a Roman emperor, Valerian, in battle, a humiliation that would have been unthinkable a century prior. In the west, the Germanic tribes found that the once impenetrable Roman line was now porous and undermanned. To make matters worse, the empire literally began to break apart. A breakaway state known as the Gallic Empire formed in the west, while the merchant queen Zenobia carved out the Palmyrene Empire in the east. For a moment, it appeared the map of the Mediterranean would be shattered forever. Yet, the Roman spirit possessed a strange, stubborn resilience. A series of tough, soldier emperors from the Illyrian regions, modern-day Balkans, fought tooth and nail to pull the world back together. The most notable was Aurelian, who in just 5 years managed to defeat the breakaway empires and reunite the Roman world, earning him the title, Restorer of the World. But even he could not fix the underlying rot. The currency was debased until it was little more than copper washed in silver. Inflation skyrocketed, and the once booming trade networks of the Mediterranean began to shrink as roads became unsafe and cities retreated behind massive new defensive walls. It was an emperor named Diocletian who finally realized that the empire was simply too large for one man to govern. He instituted the Tetrarchy, or the Rule of Four, dividing the empire into east and west, each with a senior and junior emperor. He tried to freeze the economy in place with price edicts and turned the emperor into a remote, god-like figure, hidden behind layers of court ritual. The citizen was now a subject, the soldier was now a peasant militiaman. The old, open world of the Republic was a distant, unrecognizable memory. But the most seismic shift was yet to come. Following another round of civil wars, a commander named Constantine emerged victorious at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Legend says that before the battle, he saw a vision in the sky, a cross of light with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether his conversion was a matter of genuine faith or brilliant political calculation remains one of history's greatest debates. Regardless, the Edict of Milan in 313 ended the centuries of persecution and set Christianity on the path to becoming the state religion. Constantine didn't just change the gods of Rome, he changed its geography. He looked to the east, to the ancient city of Byzantium on the shores of the Bosphorus, the gateway between Europe and Asia. There, he built a new Rome, Constantinople. This city was Christian from its birth, filled with grand churches rather than pagan temples, and protected by walls that would hold for 1,000 years. As the center of gravity shifted to the east, the old city of Rome, the mother of the empire, began to feel like a relic of the past. The 4th century was a time of strange contradictions. The empire looked grander and more autocratic than ever, but beneath the surface, it was brittle. The army was now largely composed of Germanic federates, barbarians who had been settled on Roman land to defend it against other barbarians. The line between Roman and Goth was blurring. The Church was now a powerful political entity, with bishops often wielding more local influence than governors. Then came the year 378. At the Battle of Adrianople, a massive Roman army was annihilated by the Visigoths, and the Emperor Valens was killed on the field. This wasn't just a defeat, it was a psychological earthquake. The barbarians were no longer just raiding, they were inside the house, and they weren't leaving. In the year 410, for the first time in 800 years, the city of Rome itself was sacked by Alaric and his Goths. The news sent shockwaves across the world. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, wept, asking, "If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" The final decades of the Western Empire were a slow-motion collapse. A series of puppet emperors were controlled by Germanic masters of the soldiers. The provinces fell away one by one. Britain was abandoned, North Africa was taken by the Vandals, and Gaul became a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms. Finally, in 476, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, carrying the names of both the founder of the city and the founder of the empire. Odoacer didn't claim the title of emperor. he sent the imperial regalia back to Constantinople, signaling that the West was no longer an empire. But Rome did not die in a single day. Its laws survived in the Germanic courts. Its language, Latin, evolved into the Romance languages of today. Its religion, Christianity, became the bedrock of European civilization. And in the East, the Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, would continue to flourish, calling themselves Romans, until the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The life of the legionary. If you were a young man in the era of Trajan, signing your life away for 25 years of service, your transformation began long before you saw a battlefield. You were no longer a citizen, you were a Miles. Your world was now defined by the Sacramento, the sacred oath of loyalty to the emperor. Training was relentless. A recruit was expected to march 20 Roman miles, about 30 kilometers, in 5 hours, carrying a pack that weighed 60 pounds. This pack, often called Marius's mules, contained everything a man needed to survive: a saw, a basket for moving earth, a spade, a hatchet, a cooking pot, and rations for 3 days. The Romans understood a fundamental truth of warfare: the shovel is as important as the sword. Every single night, no matter how tired the men were, the legion would construct a fortified camp. They dug a trench and built a wooden palisade. To a Roman, a night spent without a wall was a night spent in danger. Then there was the gear. The Lorca segmentations, the iconic plate armor, was a marvel of engineering. It consisted of iron strips fastened by leather straps, providing maximum protection against slashes while remaining flexible enough for a man to move. On his head sat the galea, a helmet designed with cheek guards and a neck flange to protect against downward blows. But the most ingenious tool was the pilum, the heavy javelin. A Roman didn't just throw a stick at his enemy. The pilum had a long, thin iron neck that was designed to bend upon impact. If it pierced an enemy's shield, it became impossible to pull out, and because the metal had bent, the shield became a heavy, useless weight that the enemy was forced to discard. Now defenseless, the enemy faced the gladius. The gladius, his paninis, was a short sword, barely 2 feet long. It wasn't meant for wide, cinematic swings. It was a stabbing weapon, designed for the tight confines of a shield wall. A Roman soldier didn't need to kill you with a flourish, he only needed to give you a 3-inch thrust to the gut, and the battle for you was over. The engineering of the Eternal City. While the legions held the world at bay, the engineers in the heart of the empire were performing miracles with stone and water. To the Romans, beauty was found in utility. If a city did not have clean water and a way to remove waste, it was not a city, it was a tomb. Consider the aqueducts. Even today, some of these structures still stand, spanning valleys with graceful stone arches. They were powered entirely by gravity. Roman engineers had to calculate a gradient, a slight slope, that would keep the water moving over dozens of miles. Sometimes, that slope was as shallow as 1 foot of drop for every 300 feet of length. If the math was off by even a fraction, the water would either stagnate or burst through the channels. This water didn't just go to the rich. It fed the great baths, the thermae. For a Roman, the bathhouse was the center of social life. It was their gym, their library, their pub, and their office. You would enter the apodyterium to change, move to the palestra to exercise, and then transition through a series of rooms: the tepidarium warm room, the caldarium hot room, and finally the frigidarium cold plunge. Beneath the floors of these baths was the hypocaust system. Slaves worked in tunnels, stoking massive furnaces that sent hot air circulating under the raised floors and through hollow bricks in the walls. It was central heating 2,000 years before it became standard in the modern West. The economy of the Mediterranean. How did Rome pay for all of this? The empire was a massive, interconnected trade zone, the likes of which wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. The Mare Nostrum, RC, was thick with merchant ships. Grain was the lifeblood of the empire. Ships the size of modern yachts sailed from Egypt and North Africa, carrying thousands of tons of wheat to feed the 1 million people living in Rome. If the grain ships were late, the emperor knew his head was on the line. To manage this, they built Ostia, a massive port city with giant warehouses and a man-made harbor that could shelter hundreds of vessels from the storms of the Tyrrhenian Sea. But it wasn't just grain. It was olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, silk from the Far East via the Silk Road, and marble from the quarries of Turkey. This was the first truly global economy. A merchant in Roman Britain could drink wine from a ceramic jar made in Tunisia, seasoned with spices from India, while wearing a tunic made of Egyptian linen. However, this economy had a dark side. It was built on the backs of millions of enslaved people. In the Roman mind, slavery was not necessarily racial, it was a matter of luck and conquest. If your city fell to the legions, you became property. Slaves worked the silver mines of Spain under horrific conditions, farmed the great estates of Italy, and served as tutors to the elite. The Roman Empire was a pinnacle of human achievement, but it was a pinnacle built on a foundation of human suffering. As we move deeper into the Roman soul, we must look beyond the physical walls of the city and the iron of the legions. To understand how Rome lasted for over a millennium, we have to look at what they believed, how they made sense of a world that was often cruel, unpredictable, and vast. For the Roman, religion was not a matter of private faith or a personal relationship with the divine. It was a contract. It was pax decorum, the peace of the gods. The logic was simple. If we perform the rituals correctly, if we offer the right sacrifices at the right time, the gods will grant Rome prosperity. If we fail, the empire falls. This was a civic duty, as essential as paying taxes or serving in the army. The Roman pantheon was a crowded house. They had a god for everything. Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the Skyfather, watched over the state. Mars, once a god of agriculture, became the grim god of war. But there were also thousands of smaller spirits, the Luria and Penates, who guarded the doorway and the kitchen cupboard of every home. A Roman didn't go to a grand temple to pray every day, they stood before a small shrine in their own house, offering a bit of incense or a pour of wine to the spirits of their ancestors. But as the empire grew, the old gods began to feel distant. In the crowded, narrow streets of the cities, people began to look for something more personal. This led to the rise of the mystery cults. From the east came the worship of Isis, the Egyptian mother goddess, offering comfort and the promise of life after death. From Persia came Mithras, the Sunslayer, whose secret rituals were performed in underground caves by soldiers seeking brotherhood and strength. These cults offered something the state religion didn't, a sense of belonging and a hope for the individual soul. Imagine a world where you could lose your wealth, your family, or your life at the whim of an emperor or a sudden plague. How do you find peace? The Stoics, like the statesman Seneca or the emperor Marcus Aurelius, argued that while you cannot control what happens to you, you can always control how you respond. To a Stoic, the only true good is virtue. Everything else, fame, money, even health, is indifferent. This philosophy created a certain type of Roman character, the gravitas. It was a dignified seriousness, a refusal to be broken by emotion or circumstance. When Seneca was ordered by Nero to take his own life, he did so with a calm that terrified his executioners. He believed that death was simply the final act of a well-ordered life. This internal discipline was the invisible glue that held the Roman administration together during its darkest centuries. If philosophy was the bread of the mind, the circus was the meat of the masses. We often think of the Colosseum as the peak of Roman entertainment, but the true heart of Roman passion was the Circus Maximus. This was a massive, U-shaped arena that could hold over 150,000 people, more than any modern NFL stadium. They didn't come to see gladiators, they came for the chariot races. This was the Formula One of the ancient world, but far more dangerous. 4 factions, the Reds, the Whites, the Blues, and the Greens, competed for glory. Fans were fanatical, often rioting in the streets over a disputed finish. The charioteers were the highest-paid athletes in human history. A successful driver like Gaius Apuleius Diocles earned a fortune that, in modern terms, would be worth billions of dollars. They drove light, wooden chariots pulled by 4 horses, rounding the sharp turns of the Spina, at breakneck speeds. Shipwrecks, the Roman term for crashes, were common and often fatal. But for the Roman public, this was life at its most vivid. It was a place where the emperor sat among his people, where the tensions of the city were bled off in a roar of hoofbeats and dust. The provinces, a world of Romans. To truly grasp the 5-hour scale of this story, we must leave the city of Rome and look at the provinces. The genius of Rome was not in destroying other cultures, but in Romanizing them. In Roman Egypt, life still revolved around the flooding of the Nile, but now the grain was measured by Roman officials and shipped in Roman hulls. In the deserts of Palmyra, Syrian merchants grew fabulously wealthy trading silk and spices, building Greek-style colonnades in the middle of the sands. The first and most enduring legacy is the rule of law. Before Rome, law was often the whim of a king or the tradition of a tribe. The Romans pioneered the idea that law should be written, public, and applied to all. Concepts we take for granted today, the idea that a person is innocent until proven guilty, the right to face your accuser, and the power of a written contract, all trace their lineage back to the 12 Tables and the later Corpus Juris Civilis. The Romans understood that an empire held together only by swords would eventually shatter, but an empire held together by a shared sense of justice could endure in the mind forever. Then, there is the language. Every time you speak English, you are speaking a language that is roughly 25 to 30% Latin. If you speak Spanish, Italian, French, or Romanian, you are essentially speaking modern Roman. Latin was the language of the scientist, the priest, and the philosopher for 1500 years after the last emperor fell. It provided a common tongue that allowed a scholar in Poland to communicate with a physician in Portugal. It gave us our alphabet and our calendar, the very way we measure the passing of our lives. But perhaps the most visible legacy is the architecture of power. Look at the domed capitals of the world, the triumphal arches in city centers, and the vast stadiums where we watch our own modern gladiators. The Romans taught us how to project authority through stone. They showed us that a building isn't just a shelter, it's a message. When we see a row of Corinthian columns, we instinctively think of stability, history, and law. That is the Roman shadow falling across the 21st century. Even the Church, which Rome once tried to extinguish, became the vessel that carried the Roman idea through the Dark Ages. The structure of the Catholic Church, its dioceses, its administrative hierarchy, and its seat in the Vatican, is a direct mirror of the Roman provincial administration. The Pontifex Maximus was once a title held by Julius Caesar. Today, it is a title held by the Pope. The empire didn't go away, it changed its clothes. As we look back on these 5 hours, we see a story of incredible contradictions. Rome was a civilization of profound beauty and unspeakable cruelty. It was a place of enlightened philosophy and systemic slavery. It gave us the aqueduct and the cross. It was a society that valued the common good, while often being torn apart by individual greed. In the end, the story of the Roman Empire is a mirror. We look at Rome to see our own potential for greatness and our own capacity for decline. We study their triumphs to learn how to build, and we study their fall to learn how to survive. The eternal city was never just a collection of marble and brick. It was the first great attempt by humanity to organize the world under a single banner of order and law. The edge of the world, life on the limes. To a Roman living in the luxury of a villa in Tuscany, the limes, the fortified borders of the empire, felt like the edge of a different universe. But for hundreds of thousands of soldiers and settlers, this was where the Roman dream met the cold reality of the wild. In the north, along the Rhine and the Danube, the legions stood guard against the Germanic tribes. This wasn't just a line of forts, it was a massive cultural exchange zone. Beyond the stone walls, barbarian traders brought furs, amber, and slaves to sell to the Romans. In return, they took back Roman coins, wine, and pottery. Over decades, these tribes became Romanized, long before they ever crossed the border as invaders. They learned the Latin tongue to haggle over prices, and they looked at the Roman way of life with a mixture of envy and resentment. But life for a soldier on the frontier was a test of endurance. We have found letters written on thin slivers of wood, the Vindolanda tablets, that reveal a surprisingly domestic side to the military machine. One letter is an invitation to a birthday party from one officer's wife to another. Another is a soldier's plea to his family back home to send him more socks and undergarments because the British winter was biting into his soul. These weren't just warriors, they were humans trying to recreate a Mediterranean lifestyle in a land of rain and fog. They built little Romes everywhere they went. Even in a remote outpost in North Africa, like Timgad, the Romans laid out a perfect grid system. They built theaters, baths, and forums in the middle of the desert. This was the Roman psychological weapon, the message that no matter how far you traveled, Rome was there. The civilization was portable. The secret life of the Roman city, Suburra and the streets. We often imagine Rome as a city of pristine white marble, but for the average Roman, the city was a sensory assault. Rome was the most densely populated city in the world until the Industrial Revolution. In the district of the Suburra, the marble ended and the reality began. The poor lived in insulae, apartment blocks that could rise 6 or 7 stories high. They were death traps. Built quickly by greedy landlords using cheap timber and sun-dried brick, these buildings collapsed or burned with terrifying frequency. There was no running water in the upper floors. If you wanted a drink or a wash, you went to the public fountain or the baths. If you had to use the latrine, you went to the public facilities, where Romans sat side by side on stone benches, gossiping and conducting business in a way that would shock modern sensibilities. The streets were so narrow and crowded that the Emperor Augustus eventually banned wagon traffic during the day. This meant that at night, the city never slept. The sound of iron-rimmed wheels on basalt paving stones echoed through the dark, a constant thunder that kept the city's million inhabitants in a state of perpetual exhaustion. Food for the common Roman was simple: a thick porridge of wheat called pulse, some olives, perhaps a bit of salted fish, and posca, a mixture of water and sour wine that was safe to drink. Meat was a rare luxury, usually only available after a public sacrifice when the remains of the animals were distributed to the crowd. This was the bread of the famous bread and circuses policy, a massive welfare system where the state provided free grain to hundreds of thousands of citizens to prevent the hunger that leads to revolution. The science of Roman might, concrete and glass. How did they build things that lasted 2,000 years? The answer lies in a substance the Romans perfected: opus caementicium, or Roman concrete. Unlike modern concrete, which often degrades after 50 or 100 years, Roman concrete actually grew stronger over time, especially when used in seawater. They discovered that by mixing volcanic ash from Mount Vesuvius with lime and rubble, they created a chemical reaction that formed a rock-hard bond. This allowed them to build the massive dome of the Pantheon and the giant vaulted ceilings of the baths. They were the first to understand that an arch doesn't just look good, it distributes weight, allowing for structures that were taller and wider than anything built by the Greeks or Egyptians. Imagine a world where the Roman technological curve had continued. By the time of the empire's peak, they had the early precursors of the steam engine, the aeolipile, and complex mechanical computers like the Antikythera mechanism. They were on the verge of an industrial revolution that was stifled only by the abundance of cheap slave labor and a lack of economic incentive to automate. Had the empire remained stable, the Renaissance might have happened 1,000 years earlier. The scientific revolution might have been led by men in togas. But history is not a straight line, it is a cycle of growth and decay. The fall of Rome was less like a sudden crash and more like the slow cooling of a giant star. As the centralized power in the West dissipated, the local lords and Germanic chieftains took over the functions of the state. The grand Roman roads, once the veins of the world, began to crack. The knowledge of how to make Roman concrete was lost to the West for over 1,000 years. The great libraries were burned or scattered. Yet, even in the darkness, the Roman ghost was the only source of legitimacy. When Charlemagne was crowned in the year 800, he didn't call himself King of the Franks alone, he claimed the title of Emperor of the Romans. Throughout the Middle Ages, the dream of a Holy Roman Empire obsessed every great monarch of Europe. They all wanted to be the new Caesar. They all wanted to recreate that lost era of universal peace and law. Today, we live in a neo-Roman age. Our modern world is defined by many of the same challenges that faced the Caesars: the struggle to maintain a vast, multicultural society, the tension between the military and the civilian government, the challenge of a globalized economy, and the question of how to provide for the masses without bankrupting the state. We look at the ruins of the Forum not just as tourists, but as students. We see in the crumbling brick of the Colosseum a warning that no civilization, no matter how powerful, no matter how technologically advanced, is guaranteed to last forever. Rome's greatest triumph wasn't its conquests, but its survival as an idea. It proved that humanity could aspire to something greater than tribalism. It showed that we could build things meant to last for eternity. It gave us a common heritage that bridges the gap between the ancient world and the space age. As the sun sets on this 5-hour exploration, we leave the Tiber River where we began. The mud and the shepherds are gone, replaced by the layers of history that have built upon those 7 hills. The story of Rome is the story of the human heart, its ambition, its brilliance, its flaws, and its enduring hope. The empire may have fallen, but the eternal city lives on in every courtroom, every university, every parliament, and every heart that believes in the power of law over chaos. The hidden engines of the frontier. While the legions are often portrayed as a wall of shields, the reality was a complex web of logistics that functioned like a biological nervous system. To maintain a 5-hour narrative, we must look at the cursus publix, the Roman postal and transport system. This was the internet of the ancient world. Spanning over 50,000 miles of paved roads, it allowed the emperor in Rome to receive news from the Scottish border or the Persian frontier in a matter of days. Relays of horses were kept at stations called mutations, placed every 10 to 15 miles. A messenger could ride a horse to exhaustion, leap onto a fresh one, and continue without stopping. This level of communication wouldn't be seen again until the arrival of the telegraph. It was this speed of information that allowed a single man to govern millions of people across 3 continents. But the roads were more than just paths for messengers. They were masterpieces of civil engineering. A Roman road was not just dirt and stone, it was a multi-layered sandwich. They dug a deep trench, filled it with heavy boulders for a foundation, added layers of gravel and lime for drainage, and topped it with tight-fitting polygonal stones. The roads were cambered, sloped slightly from the center to the sides, so that rainwater would run off into gutters. This is why you can still walk on Roman roads in Britain or Syria today. They were built to outlast the empire itself. The mystery of Roman concrete and the sea. One of the greatest, lost, secrets we are only now rediscovering through modern chemistry is the Roman mastery of the sea. While most modern concrete structures in the ocean crumble within 50 years, Roman piers and breakwaters have survived 2,000 years of salt and surf. Researchers have found that Roman engineers used a specific blend of volcanic ash from the Phlegraean fields near Naples. When this ash mixed with seawater, it triggered a rare chemical reaction, growing crystals of a mineral called tobermorite. Instead of eroding, the concrete actually became stronger and more resilient as the waves crashed against it. It was a living material. This allowed Rome to build massive artificial harbors like Caesarea, turning tiny fishing villages into world-class ports that could feed the empire's hunger for trade. The Roman healthcare system, the valetudinarian. To keep the 5-hour pace, we must also look at how Rome cared for its most valuable asset, the soldier. The Romans were the first to develop a dedicated military hospital system, known as the valetudinarian. These were sophisticated, courtyard-style buildings located in every major frontier fort. They had specialized rooms for surgery, pharmacies, and even quarantine wards for infectious diseases. Roman surgeons were surprisingly advanced. They used scalpels, bone saws, and forceps that look eerily similar to modern surgical tools. They understood the importance of boiling their instruments in water and using honey and vinegar as natural antiseptics. While they didn't understand germs, in the modern sense, their obsession with cleanliness and bad air, miasma meant that a Roman soldier had a better chance of surviving a wound than a soldier in the American Civil War nearly 1,800 years later. The Silent Half. Women of the Empire. If the history of Rome is written as a story of men in armor, it is a half-told tale. In the shadows of the marble columns, the women of Rome navigated a world where they held no formal vote, yet often wielded the power of life and death. The Roman matron was the moral anchor of the household. Unlike the secluded women of classical Athens, Roman women were visible. They attended the theater, dined with their husbands, and managed vast estates. At the highest levels, women like Livia, the wife of Augustus, or Agrippina the Younger, functioned as the ultimate power brokers. They were the architects of dynasties. But for the common woman, life was a cycle of domestic industry. The spinning of wool was not just a chore, it was a symbol of virtue. Even the wealthiest noblewomen were expected to show their dedication to the home by handling the loom. In the lower classes, women were shopkeepers, midwives, and even gladiatrices. Yes, in the pits of the arena, female fighters occasionally traded blows to the roar of the crowd, proving that the Roman thirst for spectacle knew no gender. The Roman palate, a feast of contradictions. To hear the story of Rome is to smell its kitchens. For the wealthy, a dinner party, a convivium, was a theater of excess. They didn't just eat, they performed. They consumed dormice glazed in honey, flamingo tongues, and sow's udders. But the most important ingredient in any Roman kitchen was a pungent, fermented fish sauce called garum. Garum was the salt of the ancient world. Produced in massive industrial vats along the coast of Spain and North Africa, it was made by layering fish innards with salt and letting them ferment in the sun for months. The resulting liquid was a burst of umami that the Romans put on everything, even desserts. It was the smell of the empire, salty, intense, and unmistakable. The Roman diet was also the first global diet. Because of the safety of the seas, a middle-class family in Rome could eat dates from Judea, cheese from the Alps, and pepper from the Malabar coast of India. This was a level of culinary diversity that would disappear from Europe for over 1,000 years after the empire fell. When you sat at a Roman table, you were eating the geography of 3 continents. Crime and punishment, the iron face of justice. While we celebrate Roman law, we must also acknowledge its brutality. Roman justice was exemplary, meaning it was designed to terrify the public into obedience. For the elite, the honesties, punishment was often exile or a dignified suicide. But for the humiliates, the commoners and slaves, the law was a hammer. Theft could result in being sent to the Matlala, the horrific state-run mines where the life expectancy was measured in months. For the ultimate crime of parricide, killing one's father, the punishment was the Puna Kali. Being sewn into a leather sack with a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey, and then thrown into the sea. The Romans believed that the stability of the state was worth any amount of individual suffering. This is why the cross, a slow, public, and agonizing death, became the standard punishment for rebels and runaway slaves. It was a visual reminder that while Rome offered the Pax Romana, that peace was maintained by an iron fist that never hesitated to strike. The ghosts of the Forum. As we draw this 5-hour journey to its ultimate close, we find ourselves standing once more in the Roman Forum at twilight. The tourists are gone, and the shadows of the broken arches stretch across the stones. We have seen the rise of a village, the triumph of the Republic, the decadence of the Caesars, and the slow, dignified retreat of a world-spanning power. We have walked with the legionary in the mud of Britain and sat with the philosopher in the heat of Athens. What remains? Not just the stones. What remains is the realization that Rome was the first time humanity proved it could build a system larger than a tribe. It was the first time we realized that we are all connected, by trade, by law, and by a shared human story. The pulse of the streets, the Roman market. To walk through a Roman city was to participate in a grand, noisy, and colorful experiment in commerce. The Macallum, or the Great Central Market, was where the empire's diversity was most visible. Here, the economy wasn't just numbers on a ledger, it was the smell of roasting chickpeas, the shouting of fishmongers, and the clatter of copper coins. A Roman morning began at dawn. Because artificial light was expensive and dim, the city lived by the sun. The salutation occurred in the early hours, a strange ritual where social inferiors, known as clients, would gather at the homes of their wealthy patrons to offer greetings and receive a small gift of food or money. This was the social glue of Rome. Every man was part of a chain of loyalty that led all the way up to the emperor himself. By mid-morning, the Forum was a hive of activity. Lawyers argued cases in the basilicas, massive, roofed halls that would later inspire the design of Christian churches. Money changers sat at wooden tables, converting the silver denarii of the West for the drachmae of the East. To a Roman, the Forum was the center of the universe. It was where you went to hear the news, to see a friend, or to watch a political rival be shamed. The Roman underworld, fire and water. While we admire the marble temples, the true engineering marvel of the city was hidden beneath the feet of its citizens. The Cloaca Maxima, or the Great Sewer, was one of the world's earliest sewage systems. Originally built to drain the marshes between the hills, it became the colon of the city. The Romans understood that if the waste did not move, the city would die of plague. But if water was their ally, fire was their greatest enemy. Because the apartment blocks were made largely of wood and lit by oil lamps, a single tipped candle could destroy an entire district. This led to the creation of the Vigils, the first professional firefighting force in history. These men patrolled the streets at night, carrying buckets of water and hooks to pull down burning buildings to create firebreaks. They were also the city's night watchmen, dealing with the thieves and cutthroats who haunted the unlit alleys of the Suburra. The logistics of leisure, the great games. As the day progressed toward the afternoon, the work of the city stopped. Rome was a society that valued leisure, or otium, as much as it valued work, or negotium. At the theater of Pompey, thousands would gather to watch mimes and pantomimes. Unlike the heavy tragedies of the Greeks, Roman theater was often bawdy, satirical, and incredibly visual. They used complex stage machinery, elevators, trapdoors, and even systems to spray scented water over the audience to keep them cool. But the most sought-after leisure was the bath. By the mid-afternoon, the great baths like those of Caracalla or Diocletian were packed. Imagine a structure that could hold 1,600 people at once, featuring marble walls, mosaic floors, and vaulted ceilings that seemed to touch the sky. This was where the Roman became a Roman. In the heat of the steam room, the senator and the shopkeeper were equal, stripped of their tunics and their status, sharing the latest gossip about the wars in Dacia or the latest scandal in the palace. The final horizon. The silence of the ruins. As we bring this 5-hour narrative to its ultimate conclusion, we find ourselves standing on the Appian Way. The road stretches straight as an arrow toward the horizon, lined with the tombs of the great families of old. We have explored the rise of the Republic, the fire of the legions, the decadence of the emperors, and the quiet resilience of the common people. We have seen how a single city transformed into a global idea, an idea that refused to die even when its walls were breached. The Roman Empire was not just a period of time. It was a peak of human organization, a testament to what we can achieve when we build for the future rather than just the day. Though the statues have lost their paint and the names of the common soldiers are forgotten, the world they built is the world we still inhabit. The Roman mind, science and the natural world. While the Greeks were the great theorists of antiquity, the Romans were the great practitioners. They did not just want to know why the stars moved. They wanted to know how to use them to sail a ship to Canidium. This practical science created a world that was remarkably modern in its data-driven approach. Consider the work of Pliny the Elder. His Naturalis Historia was one of the first true encyclopedias. He attempted to catalogue every known fact about the world, from the chemistry of minerals to the biology of forest creatures. Though some of his entries seem like folklore today, his method was revolutionary. He believed that the world was a book that could be read and understood through observation. He died as he lived, investigating the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, driven by a scientific curiosity that outweighed his fear of the volcano. In the field of medicine, the Roman world was dominated by the figure of Galen. A physician to emperors and a survivor of the Antonina plague, Galen's studies on anatomy and the nervous system remained the gold standard for over 1,000 years. Roman doctors were among the first to understand the importance of the pulse and the connection between the brain and the body's movements. They pioneered specialized tools for eye surgery and developed sophisticated herbal pharmacopoeias, utilizing plants from every corner of the empire to treat everything from migraines to malaria. The language of power. Latin's long shadow. As the political borders of the empire dissolved, the empire of the mind took over. Latin did not die, it simply went to work. During the Middle Ages, Latin was the only thing that kept the intellectual light of Europe from flickering out. It was the language of the Magna Carta, the language of the first universities in Bologna and Oxford, and the language that Newton used to write his laws of physics. Even today, when a botanist names a new flower or a lawyer argues a case pro bono, they are speaking the language of a people who lived 2 millennia ago. Latin provides a universal vocabulary for humanity's highest pursuits. It is a linguistic ghost that ensures that even if we are separated by thousands of miles, we are using the same conceptual tools to understand our world. The Renaissance. Rome reborn. In the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe experienced a rebirth that was, in reality, a re-Romanization. After centuries of neglect, thinkers like Petrarch and artists like Michelangelo began to dig through the dirt of Italy, literally and figuratively. They found the lost statues, the hidden manuscripts, and the forgotten architectural techniques. When Brunelleschi looked at the Pantheon in Rome, he didn't see an ancient ruin, he saw a challenge. He studied the Roman use of herringbone, brickwork and concrete to build the Great Dome of Florence. The Renaissance was the moment the student finally caught up to the teacher. The modern world was born not by rejecting Rome, but by rediscovering it. The Infinite Road. Our 5-hour journey has taken us from a muddy village on the Tiber to the very edges of the known world, and finally into the modern heart of the 21st century. We have seen how Rome built the roads that we still travel, both the physical roads of stone and the intellectual roads of law, language, and logic. History is often taught as a series of ends, the fall of Rome, the end of the Republic. But the true story of Rome is one of continuity. Rome is a process. It is the ongoing attempt of human beings to create a civilization that is larger than their own lifespans. It is the belief that order is better than chaos, and that the works of our hands can outlast the beating of our hearts. The Roman character, virtue and vice. To truly know a people, you must know what they valued most. For the Roman, that word was virtus. To us, it sounds like virtue, but to them, it meant something far more rugged. It was manliness, the courage to stand your ground in a shield wall, the discipline to follow orders, and the integrity to keep your word even when it cost you everything. Alongside virtus stood fides, or reliability. The Romans viewed themselves as a people of their word. This wasn't just morality, it was the foundation of their legal system. If a Roman made a contract, he believed the gods were watching the transaction. This cultural obsession with good faith allowed them to build a global economy based on trust, long before modern banking existed. But they were also a people of intense superstition. A Roman general would not begin a battle if the sacred chickens refused to eat their grain, a sign that the gods were displeased. If a crow flew in the wrong direction or a lightning bolt struck a specific tree, the entire Senate might halt its business for the day. This duality, the cold, logical engineer who also feared a bad omen, is what makes the Roman soul so endlessly fascinating. The language of the ages. As we prepare to leave the Roman world, we listen to the echoes of their language. Latin was a language of precision, designed for law and command. Many of the phrases they used are still the pillars of our own intellectual life. Consider carpe diem, seize the day. Often used today to mean, have fun, to the Roman, it was a reminder of the brevity of life. Because they lived in a world of high infant mortality and constant war, they understood that every hour was a gift. Or, vita, vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. Julius Caesar's famous report to the Senate was the ultimate expression of Roman efficiency. It was a language that didn't waste words, a language built for a people who were always on the move, always building, and always expanding. And finally, memento mori, remember that you will die. During a Roman triumph, as a victorious general paraded through the streets in a gold chariot, a slave stood behind him, whispering these words in his ear. It was a safeguard against hubris. It was a reminder that even the most powerful man in the world was still just a man, subject to the same tides of time that eventually claimed the empire itself. The infinite legacy. We have reached the end of our 5-hour journey. We have seen Rome in its infancy as a collection of mud huts, and we have seen it as a global titan that redefined the human experience. We have seen its blood-soaked arenas and its quiet, thoughtful libraries. The story of Rome is a testament to the fact that while men die and empires crumble, the ideas they create are immortal. Rome is the foundation upon which the modern world is built. It is the architect of our cities, the author of our laws, and the grandfather of our languages. As the audio fades, let the weight of these centuries settle in your mind. The next time you walk past a government building, see a paved road, or speak a word of English, remember that you are a part of a story that began nearly 3,000 years ago on the banks of a river in Italy. The fire of Vesta may have been extinguished, but the light of Rome continues to illuminate the world. The steam engine of Alexandria, a lost industrial age? One of the most tantalizing, what-if scenarios in human history lies in a small device called the Aeolipile, invented by Hero of Alexandria in the 1st century AD. It was, quite literally, a rocket-style reaction engine, a hollow sphere that rotated when steam was pushed through bent nozzles. For a moment, the Roman world stood on the precipice of an industrial revolution nearly 1,700 years before it actually happened. They had the metallurgy to build boilers, the coal mines in Britain to provide fuel, and the engineering mindsets to create complex gear systems. So why didn't they? Historians argue that the Roman economy was a victim of its own success. With a massive population of enslaved people providing cheap, manual labor, there was little incentive for the wealthy elite to invest in labor-saving machinery. The steam age remained a curiosity, a toy used to open temple doors automatically or entertain guests at banquets. This serves as a poignant lesson in our journey. Technology alone does not change the world. The social and economic will to use it must exist first. The unbroken thread, the Byzantine continuation. While we speak of the fall of Rome, we must remember that for half the world, the empire never fell. In the East, the Roman Empire, which we call Byzantine, continued to flourish in Constantinople. They kept the Roman law, the Roman bureaucracy, and the Roman military tradition alive. When the West was struggling through the early medieval period, the East was building the Hagia Sophia, a dome so massive and ethereal that it was said to be suspended from heaven by a golden chain. They preserved the Greek and Roman classics that would later spark the Renaissance. To a citizen in Constantinople in the year 1000, they weren't Byzantine, they were Romaoi, Romans. The flame was not extinguished, it was simply carried to a new hearth. The archaeology of the future. Today, we are still discovering Rome. Every time a new subway line is dug in Rome or a field is plowed in North Africa, we find more pieces of the puzzle. Using modern technology like lidar and satellite imagery, we are finding thousands of lost Roman villas and fortifications hidden beneath the forests of Europe and the sands of the Sahara. We are finding that the Roman world was even more interconnected than we imagined. We have found Roman coins in Japanese tombs and Roman glass in the burial mounds of Scandinavian kings. The empire was a heartbeat that sent ripples across the entire globe, touching cultures that the Caesars never even knew existed. The eternal journey. Our 5-hour exploration is complete. We have traveled from the mythic founding of a city to the scientific mysteries of its greatest minds. We have seen that Rome was not just a period of history, but a laboratory for the human experience. It taught us how to govern, how to build, how to fight, and ultimately, how to endure. The road of Rome does not end in the past, it is a bridge to the future. As long as we value the rule of law, the pursuit of knowledge, and the strength of a unified society, the Roman Empire will never truly be a ruin. It will remain a living, breathing part of who we are. The silent frontier. Life in Roman Dacia and Palmyra. While we have spent much time in the marble halls of Rome, the true strength of the empire lay in its ability to absorb the peripheral worlds. To understand the 5-hour scale of this story, we must look at the extremes. In the east, there was Palmyra, a caravan city rising like a mirage from the Syrian desert. Here, Roman culture wore a silk robe. The people spoke Aramaic, worshipped Semitic gods, yet they built their city with Roman colonnades and operated under Roman law. This was the empire's soft power, the idea that you could be a proud Palmyrene and a loyal Roman citizen at the same time. The wealth of the Silk Road flowed through these gates, bringing incense, spices, and exotic animals that would eventually end up in the Colosseum. Conversely, in the north, we find Dacia, modern-day Romania. This was a land of gold mines and rugged mountains, conquered in a series of brutal campaigns by the Emperor Trajan. To hold this territory, the Romans built the longest stone bridge in the ancient world across the Danube River. This bridge was a message: no river is wide enough to stop Rome. Even today, the Romanian language stands as a Latin island in a sea of Slavic and Hungarian tongues, a linguistic fossil of a conquest that happened nearly 2,000 years ago. The Roman bureaucracy, the invisible machine. How did a city of 1 million govern an empire of 60 million without computers, telephones, or even a fast postal service? They did it through the tabularium, the Roman record office. The Romans were obsessed with data. They conducted censuses every few years, tracking every citizen, every head of cattle, and every acre of land. They understood that to rule, you must first measure. This bureaucracy was the invisible legion. While the soldiers fought the battles, the clerks in their tunics were the ones who ensured the soldiers were paid, the grain was moved, and the taxes were collected. This system created a level of stability that allowed people to plan for the future. A farmer in Spain could plant an olive grove knowing it would take 20 years to reach full production, confident that the Roman law would still be there to protect his property when the harvest finally came. This predictability was the greatest gift Rome gave to the ancient world. The Stoics' twilight. As the sun sets on our 5-hour journey, we return to the words of the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius. In his private journals, he wrote, "Time is a sort of river of passing events, and strong is its current. No sooner is a thing brought to sight than it is swept by and another takes its place, and this too will be swept away." He was right. The empire was swept away. The marble fell, the legions disbanded, and the emperors became names in dusty books. But the river Marcus spoke of carried the silt of Rome into every corner of the modern world. We see Rome when we look at our own governments, our own languages, and our own ambitions to build something that lasts. We see Rome in our struggle to balance freedom with security and luxury with duty. The story of the Roman Empire is not just a history of the past, it is a guidebook for the human future. The Roman senses, a world of color and sound. When we look at the ruins of the Roman world today, we see white marble and gray stone. We imagine a world that was silent and austere. But the reality was a riot of color and a cacophony of sound. The statues that we now admire for their pure, white stone were originally painted in vivid, almost gaudy colors. Augustus, Caesar, and the gods were depicted with realistic skin tones, bright red robes, and gilded jewelry. To a Roman, a white statue was unfinished. The city was a kaleidoscope of pigments: Egyptian blue, Tyrian purple, and yellow ochre. The soundscape was equally intense. In the narrow streets, the air was filled with the rhythmic thwack of fullers beating wool, the cries of street vendors selling hot sausages and leeks, and the constant humming of thousands of voices. There was no quiet in Rome. Even at night, the sound of the heavy transport wagons, banned during the day, created a low, mechanical rumble that defined the urban experience. To be Roman was to live in a state of sensory overload. The Roman underworld, magic, curses, and luck. Beneath the rational surface of Roman law and engineering lay a world of deep, dark magic. The average Roman was intensely superstitious, and their daily life was guided by a desire to control the unseen forces of the world. Archaeologists have found thousands of depictions, curse tablets. These were thin sheets of lead upon which a person would scratch a curse against a rival, a thief, or a lover who had spurned them. The tablet would then be folded, pierced with a nail, and thrown into a sacred spring or buried in a grave to enlist the help of the spirits of the underworld. Luck was not a random occurrence to a Roman, it was a physical force. This is why the image of the tintinnabulum, wind chimes with protective symbols, was so common. They hung these in shops and doorways to ward off the evil eye. Even the most powerful senators would wear amulets or perform specific gestures to protect their fascinum, or their personal life force. This blend of high-level administrative logic and primal, ancient magic is what makes the Roman era so uniquely human. The logistics of the empire, the supply chain of the gods. As we reach the conclusion of this 5-hour journey, we must appreciate the sheer scale of Roman logistics. Consider the Monte Testaccio in Rome. It is not a natural hill, it is a mountain of broken pottery. Specifically, it is made of an estimated 53 million olive oil amphorae. This hill is a monument to the first global supply chain. Each jar was stamped with the name of the producer, the weight of the oil, and the name of the official who inspected it. This level of quality control and mass distribution wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. It reminds us that Rome was a machine that converted the resources of 3 continents into a lifestyle that defined an era. The art of memory, the funeral and the mask. To a Roman, the greatest tragedy was not death, but being forgotten. This obsession with memory created one of the most unique traditions in history, the Imagines. When a prominent Roman died, a wax mask was made of their face, capturing their likeness with startling, sometimes brutal realism. These masks were kept in small wooden shrines in the home. During the funerals of descendants, actors would wear these masks and dress in the robes of the ancestors, walking in the procession as if the dead had returned to life to welcome the newcomer. This was the Roman way of saying that the family was an unbroken chain. A Roman did not die as an individual, they were a link between the past and the future. This psychological need for permanence is why they carved their names so deeply into stone. From the grand arches of the emperors to the humble graffiti of a tavern keeper in Pompeii, the message was the same: I was here. I existed. I was part of the Roman story. The economy of the soul, the life of a Roman slave. As we approach the end of this 5-hour journey, we must acknowledge the invisible engine of Rome, the enslaved. It is a harsh truth that the marble beauty of the empire was built on a foundation of human bondage. However, Roman slavery was distinct from the systems that followed in later centuries. It was not based on race, but on the misfortune of war or debt. A slave in Rome was not always a laborer in the fields. They were doctors, architects, accountants, and musicians. Many were more educated than their masters. Crucially, Rome provided a path out. Through the process of manumission, a slave could be granted freedom, becoming a libertus, or freedman. Their children would be full Roman citizens. This social mobility, the idea that a slave's grandson could eventually sit in the Senate, gave the Roman system a strange, resilient strength. It turned former enemies into invested stakeholders in the Roman dream. The final hour, the echoes of the Appian Way. We conclude our journey on the Via Appia, the Queen of Roads. As you walk south from Rome, the road is lined with thousands of monuments, grand circular tombs for noblemen and simple stone plaques for soldiers. The Romans believed that as long as a person's name was spoken aloud, they were not truly dead. Over these 5 hours, we have spoken their names. We have called back Romulus and Caesar, Agrippina and Marcus Aurelius. We have walked through their markets and stood in their shield walls. The Roman Empire didn't just give us buildings, it gave us a template for human potential. It showed us that we can organize millions under a single law, that we can bridge rivers and mountains, and that we can create a culture that survives the collapse of the state that birthed it. The marble has crumbled, the legions are gone, and the fire of Vesta is cold. But the idea of Rome, the idea of a world united by law, engineering, and shared identity, remains the highest mountain in our historical landscape. We are still climbing that mountain. We are still building on their foundations. The story of Rome is not finished. It continues in every courtroom that seeks justice, every engineer who builds for the century, and every person who looks at the stars and dreams of a unified humanity.